and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. This is our first episode with a great guest, Yevhen Hlibovytsky, my old friend and amazing expert in Ukrainian politics. He's a founder and one of the leaders of ProMova think tank, one of the leading liberal pro-Ukrainian and pro-European think tanks in Ukraine. And Yevhen, we have got first in contact in 2015, shortly after the first stage of the first Russian invasion in Ukraine was over, and some sort of like a frozen conflict ideas have been promoted, mostly by the West, with the idea that both Ukraine and Russia should just stop and start to talk with Minsk agreement and with all what further. We know now from the year 2023 that it was a clear mistake from the West, and we know that the threats which the Ukrainians were talking about of the Russian imperialism, of the Russian aggression, that Putin and Moscow and Russia never stop. They always want to get more. That these warnings were right, but nobody heard in the West. Still, like now, like after these years of the war or 1 year of the full-scale invasion of Russia, what are your observations? Are there any changes in the West and in Ukraine? What did it mean for Ukrainians?
I think it's a race against time. Ukraine is full of very young agency, and that agency needs time to strengthen and build up institutions to be able to be persuasive in the eyes of the partners. But I also think it takes time for people in the West to adapt their thinking to new conditions. And in many cases, that involves changing the paradigm. Ukraine has been viewed through colonial optics for a long time. It takes time to realize that Ukraine has been off Western agenda, not because Ukrainians didn't do something, or not because someone was particularly prejudiced against Ukraine, but because the mainstream view of the former Soviet Union was very Russocentric. And it takes time to decolonialize the Western thinking, just as it takes time for Ukraine to strengthen its ability to present itself. The problem is that we don't have that time, and that time actually is so scarce that every time we're late for a deadline with a decision, someone has to pay for it with their own lives. And that is a constant reminder that every part of the equation, both European and Ukrainian, both Western and Ukrainian, had to do its homework, and both sides failed to do it.
I will come back to that mentioning of time. But first, did the Ukrainians themselves believe that they would be able to do what they have achieved within these 13 months of the full-scale invasion? Did the Ukrainians expect that they can beat the Russians?
There certainly was a lot of anxiety in Ukraine, and a lot of people were asking the questions how reformed the Ukrainian army is, how able Ukraine is to withstand not against a limited operation like the Russians had in Donbass or Crimea, but against a full-scale invasion. At the same time, there was appreciation of the fact that Ukrainian army was developing between 2014 2022 with great help from the West and NATO. And the question was whether the training and the changes and the reforms have reached critical mass. And if we look through institutional lens, usually we don't see the changes being big enough. But there's also a cultural part of the dimension, and cultural part of the dimension actually works in Ukraine's favor, because the difference in managerial culture in Russia and in Ukraine is that Russian is highly centralized, and Ukrainian is actually rather a culture of a network society. Therefore, if there is an uncertainty, especially in the beginning of the war, we saw that the Russian soldiers would rather expect for the commanding officer to make the decision and tell them what to do. If Ukrainians are faced with uncertainty, Ukrainians would actually take matters into their own hands and try to decide what to do. And that gave Ukraine a tremendous advantage in the early days of the war. At the same time, we now see that still the assistance that Ukraine received was not enough. The arms shipments came in too late, and the arms that Ukraine should have had before the full-scale invasion is only the arms are only coming now. And I think this war is a failure of the international institutions that are meant to prevent the war. I think that this war is a reminder that peace is extremely fragile if we decide to turn off the early warning signs, and if we go ahead with our prejudice and our self-righteous beliefs that we cannot be wrong. And this is exactly what happened with Ukraine. I think there was a tremendous misinterpretation of Ukraine from the beginning of Ukraine's independence in 1991, both in the United States and in the European community. I think there was a significant underappreciation of the roles that Ukraine can play in the international peace. And I think this is a lasting legacy that actually extends until today, and I'm afraid will extend into the future. But at the same time, it's also a question whether we can all develop a more holistic approach towards the world and see not only the direct consequences of our actions, but also see how they affect other stakeholders. And if I would apply the same rough criteria towards Ukraine as we're usually applying towards those that we're dissatisfied with, in many cases, Ukraine would also be the country that didn't do enough and could have done better in the past.
When you talk about the case, which I agree, that the West doesn't supply enough and doesn't supply enough fast, like the Western military support comes too late and not in the volume that would allow Ukraine to finish this war with one decisive offensive. Is it because the West doesn't understand that this war is existential war? Is it because there is still a hope that it can be contained as a local conflict?
There are so many dimensions to this war that in some cases, it's difficult to grasp how this layered cake of dimensions actually comes together. This is an existential war for Ukrainians. It's also an anti-colonial war for Ukrainians. It's also a war for agency that allows Ukrainians to choose for themselves whether they want to be part of EU, NATO, or any other organization. It's also a imperial war for Russia. It's also a war of authoritarian or even totalitarian country against democracy. It's also a war of a culture that was prevented from transforming with the culture that was actually transforming very fast. So if you look at this war, there's a number of dimensions, and ending the war in one dimension does not necessarily end the war in other dimensions. If Ukraine regains its territorial integrity, that doesn't mean that the war is over, because the deep root of the problem lays in the imperial Russian culture that is shared not only by the Russian elites and Putin, but also shared by millions and millions, if not tens of millions of Russian citizens. We see the polling that shows that Russians are keeping up their support of Putin, over a year after the invasion. There was enough time to reflect. There was enough time to try and think twice about this. But we see very steady figures in opinion polls. That means that there is a cultural problem, and we'll have to deal with that cultural problem. And dealing with cultural problems is actually difficult if you're not dealing with it inside Russia. And this war does not develop along the Second World War lines and principles. I can hardly imagine someone else's boots on the ground in Russia. And that means that if other tools are not utilized to maximum effect, we may end up in a situation when peace that will eventually be achieved will not be a lasting peace. And that after a while, the war would start over with new force, with new technologies, with new arms.
That is exactly the fear that many people in Ukraine share currently. What can guarantee the security of Ukraine after this war is ended? If we imagine Ukraine has reinstalled its sovereignty over the whole territory, including Donbass and Crimea, and I personally believe that will be a case pretty soon, what will prevent Russia from attacking Ukraine once again? Or if Russia attacks Ukraine once again, what will guarantee that Ukraine will be able to repel this attack fast without all the occupation and terror which Ukrainians have experienced during this full-scale invasion? Is it the EU membership? Is it NATO membership? Is it some sort of another defensive mechanisms? What could be the most successful and clear way to protect Ukraine from the next attack?
I'm afraid if we have a situation that the next attack has to be repelled somehow, we have lost it. We have failed in our attempt to actually deter Russia from doing that. We have two solutions that may actually improve Ukraine's chances, that can bring greater security to Ukraine. And we have one solution that can actually make it quite evident for Ukraine that there will be no more war with Russia. The two solutions that we can talk about is either Ukraine becoming incredibly well armed and European military power that can actually be so good in military aspect that the price of attack against Ukraine for Russia would be enormous. This is still a bad deterrence for the reason that that would take a lot of resources away from education, from well-being, from other pressing needs that Ukrainian society has.
Don't forget the long border between Russia and Ukraine. You need to protect an absolute plain border without any natural barriers.
There are about 2,000 kilometers of that border. And I'm afraid if Russia attacks again, someone will be killed, even if Ukraine repels it successfully. So this is not, from the point of view of these people or family members, this is not a good solution. The other solution is NATO Article 5. NATO Article 5 actually provides much better guarantee than probably anything else we've experienced. But it's a good question whether NATO will actually transform to the extent that it will be persuasive in the eyes of a dictator like Putin, who has little to lose. And NATO is just as strong as its combined force of its members. And many members have clearly neglected their armies, and many members have clearly neglected their ability, their capacity to be serious players. And there are enough rifts inside NATO that even in certain situations could allow one or two countries to block the common perception of threat and block action in response to that perception. So NATO is also a conditional improvement of security for Ukraine, even though I think it's probably the best out of all of the ones that we have easily available on the table. The third and the best security guarantee for Ukraine is if Russia ceases to be an empire and it becomes a nation state. And that means the significant domestic transformation of Russia and of what kind of state it is.
You mean the dissolution of Russia and appearance of many national states, including a Russian national state?
That would be one of most likely scenarios, that Russia would not be the country which Russifies the non-Russian entities, that Russia would not be the country that actually exploits the resources of its territories for the benefit of its incredibly centralized state. And that would mean that Russia is no longer the country that sees its own population as a resource that can be expendable for the sake of greatness or for the sake of some historical beliefs that actually don't add up. And if we look through this lens, then that means that the whole set of international partners would have to be much stricter with their Russia policies. And that means that the political scenes inside the European countries, inside the United States, would have to firmly believe that there is no way to go back to Russia as it was. And I think there are a lot of people in the business community, there are a lot of people in the security community, there are a lot of people in diplomatic community who would actually hope that one day they could go back to great Russia, but somehow being fixed or being on the right track, hopefully with Navalny or someone else who could potentially lead Russia and not be an autocrat and not be a threat to the world order. Not understanding that even if there is a short period of Russia that is non-threatening to the international order, it will eventually have incentives to actually become a threat as long as it stays in its imperial borders, as long as it has entities that were trying to break away and that were either defeated or deceived into staying, that has the entities that were basically pushed to the extreme limit where their agency is not seen anymore, and that would be most of the national minorities living in Russia. And this is exactly the issue. You know, we're talking a lot about the fate of Uyghurs in China, but there are a lot of ethnic groups in Russia that are hardly in better conditions than the Uyghurs and are not on the international agenda, are not on first pages of the newspapers. So I think that we would have to think how we can achieve sustainable peace, not a temporary peace. And if we want to achieve sustainable peace, and if we want to make sure that the military expenditures as part of the GDP do not grow and eventually cannibalize expenditures for healthcare, for education, for other needs that societies have, then we have to think smart. And we're not thinking smart at the moment.
When we talk about the future of Ukraine after this war ends with the Ukrainian victory, uh, we know that Ukraine will stand in front of a lot of challenges. Maybe no country has faced in Europe since at least 60 years or 80 years since the World War II. Ukraine will have to return its population back. Ukraine will have to rebuild the destroyed cities, to clear huge territory, which is as big as the United Kingdom, from the landmines and unexploded ordnances. Ukraine will need to repair a lot of infrastructure, including energy, including transport, and regain the economic growth which Ukraine has lost during the war. We know the Ukrainian GDP has collapsed by like 30%, and only the monetary support helps the Ukrainian government to keep payments running. So a lot of change, a lot of challenges on all the fronts, and maybe also a huge chance to modernize the country and to select the new way, the modern way, like with the building of the new cities in the east instead of those which have been destroyed by the Russians. Like, what do you think? How will it look like? Who will live in the new Marinka? Who will live in new Mariupol? Who will build Mariupol, and for whom, and under which conditions?
As much as I would like to engage in a discussion of future Ukraine and how it would look like, I think it's serving us a bad service if we do that, because that takes away us from actually making sure that Ukraine comes victorious. And if we start seriously discussing reconstruction right now, the risk is that we will reconstruct something that will be further destroyed by the following attack. And I think we have to be extremely clear internationally that we can seriously devise reconstruction only after we have ended the war. And if we are talking about ending the war, that means that there is no greater capacity, no more capacity on the Russian side to invade. That Russia has lived through transformations that do not allow Russia to be an aggressor again. And I think we're far away from that. If we are discussing what the end of the war looks like, there are a lot of discussions in the West, even the good ones, that actually talk about preliminary stage, like, for instance, liberating the territory of Ukraine, including Crimea. But they see it not as preliminary, but as the end goal. But actually, that doesn't mean that once Ukraine liberates all of its territories, that they will not be shelled again, that they will not be invaded again, that eventually we will not end up in a kind of world where an external support for Russia might actually allow Russia to keep on using its genocidal policies and employing its genocidal policies against Ukraine. I would be cautious in talking about reconstruction before I see the light in the end of the tunnel, and I clearly don't see the light in the end of the tunnel right now. Ukraine is clearly in a position where it has to prioritize its objectives, and it has to think whether, for political reasons, for instance, Crimea is more important than Donbass. And if we are in a situation when Ukraine has to basically collect the tanks and the cannons and the arms, piece by piece, and is not able to be persuasive enough to get enough supply of shells, to get enough supply of other materials to actually end the war militarily and go to the next stage, actually inspiring, supporting the domestic change in Russia. That would probably be another huge political task. If we don't get that, we might actually end up in a war of attrition. War of attrition is not to anyone's benefit. The Ukrainian society would suffer, the Russian society would suffer, the quality of life of the Western citizens would suffer. The only clear winner will be the defense sector of economy in the Western countries, because that would mean that they don't only have to replenish and produce some additional reserve of armaments, but that would mean that they will have many, many, many years of successful contracts because the fighting will go on and on and on and on and on. The war has catastrophic demographic effect. The war has devastating cultural effect. The war is actually producing the voids that would better not be developed. We see how China is growing in influence in Russia. And this is clearly because of the Russian leadership that makes strategic mistakes, that China is now in a position to view itself as a senior partner of Chinese-Russian alliance. This is the dawn of the new world with many challenges if we don't put the coalition together firm enough to end the fighting swiftly and make sure that the political pressures will follow to make the next war impossible.
Well, Thank you, Yevhen. It was very informative and a lot of insight knowledge and a lot of perspective you have provided us. And you see that Ukraine remains in the focus of our vital interest because for both the EU and the US, Ukraine remains a country where not only the fate of this war has been decided, but also the future of our Western world and how it will look like in 10 years and 15 years. So that's why follow us, continue to watch our video channel and get new information from Ukraine and about European resilience. And also don't forget to donate for our projects which support Ukrainian fight, which support Ukrainian people, and which help us to provide you with information from Ukraine. Thank you and have a good day.